Florida continues its efforts to cover up the things that are happening in the state that are wrong. A new law, SB184, will prevent people from being 25 feet or recording within 25 feet of a police arrest. Now, inherently, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, even before this law existed, you should give law enforcement their space if they're doing something like arresting somebody. Now, of course, the vast majority of arrests are legitimate, but they are the handling of a few groups that are marginalized by law enforcement and deprived of due process, like the homeless population, for example, which are looked at as less than human in the state of Florida by law enforcement, where a little bit of scrutiny wouldn't hurt. In that case, I recently was recording in Bradenton, Florida, the arrest of a homeless person, and I had a police officer aggressively yell at me that if I got any closer, he would arrest me. Then they brought another police officer out with metal chain handcuffs as if they were going to arrest me for recording.
Stay over there.
I'm just working, ma'am.
I understand. You're allowed to record. I don't really care about that.
Right.
Can you guys just move so that he doesn't react so much?
I'm saying,
I'm just doing my job just like you are. I'm doing my job just like you are, ma'am. Now, these big SUVs are 17 to 18 foot long, and the new law will require 25 feet, which means I could have been a vehicle distance away from these police officers even before this law and still have been legitimately within safe boundaries to record. But despite being at about 65 feet away from this incident, this was before the law took place, we've already had police officers insinuate that they're going to arrest you for recording them, even though you are well within a safe distance to record. And really, the reason I wanted to record this homeless person being evicted is because the police officers were ascertaining the name of the person, yet the person was being arrested for trespassing. And that opens up a legal question. How could you trespass somebody if you don't know their name? Since in the state of Florida, before you arrest somebody for trespassing, you have to warn them. In other words, they were clearly in violation of due process. And thus, there was absolutely nothing wrong with me recording from a safe distance. In fact, I was holding the camera still with both hands, which means my hands were inoperable because of the camera operation. And I was within a safe distance to record as always, but they tried to prevent me with the threat of arrest. So imagine now with a law that stipulates 25 feet. But of course, they're not going to bring a measuring tape out there. Law enforcement in Florida is simply going to now be able to arrest anybody recording them making an arrest, since after all, that is their intention. The matter of this law is the intention. As we can see from this incident in Bradenton, Florida, these police officers, even though they know they were on camera, had absolutely no problem threatening to arrest me, despite the fact I was within a safe boundary. I wasn't interfering with what they were doing. I was just doing my journalism work on a topic that we had already covered. Therefore, we can see that the intention varies from the law's written boundaries or goals. There's nothing wrong with this law inherently. You shouldn't be, even before the law, you wouldn't get that close to somebody being arrested because you have to give police officers their space. And even before this law, the state of Florida already stipulates that if a police officer asks you to reasonably move, you have to move regardless. So even then, you can be arrested for obstruction, even though their request may be reasonable or not. You're not going to stand up to a police officer because they're going to arrest you. So SB184, the new law coming to Florida, is for you to know that you can no longer record within 25 feet of a police officer if asked to do so. The problem is now, what if a police officer were to start approaching you and force you to back off from the scene, claiming that they are the scene? That opens up the question of the real intention of this law. The real intention of this law is that the state of Florida doesn't want arrests recorded. Now, the timing of this law is interesting as it coincides with the new regulations on homelessness, which most people are going to consider to be somewhat of a violation of human rights and somewhat unconstitutional. Therefore, what the state of Florida is really doing here is making sure that when they go ahead and start to arrest the homeless people, that anybody interfering or recording this will be able to be arrested or have at least the threat of arrest. And of course, 25 feet is a safe boundary. The clear and obvious problem is that now law enforcement will definitely prevent you from recording scenes or be able to somewhat interfere with what you're doing. This is because many times law enforcement is tampering with evidence of the arrest because there's some type of lack of due process. Now, this has never been a problem in the state of Florida. The reason these laws are coming now is because recently the state of Florida law enforcement has been depriving people of due process. And without a doubt, with this new law, I can guarantee you that law enforcement officers will definitely find ways to prevent people from recording scenes or interfere with the recording, which is literally tampering with evidence, which is what law enforcement wants to do, is they want to go ahead and do what they want to do and not be recorded. If you're doing nothing wrong, then there's nothing to fear. And in the vast majority of these cases, bystanders are knowing that they're doing nothing more than recording and not interfering. And again, inherently nothing wrong with this law. The law doesn't even exist, and I wouldn't get that close to law enforcement presence. You keep a safe distance and whatnot. Within 25 feet, it's a very safe distance to record. But I can tell you that even before the implication of this law, as I've been trying to record things in Florida for all real legitimate journalistic purposes, law enforcement in Florida will many times interfere with your ability to do your work when you're not interfering with their ability to do theirs. And I think personally what I'm going to do moving forward is, instead of trying to record up close with a cell phone, I'm going to buy a long distance zoom in camera with a good feature of zoom in audio that I can actually zoom into these things from a long distance away and be able to get really good footage of what's happening without law enforcement being aware of you recording them. Because once they're aware of you recording them, if they're trying to hide something, then they're just going to interfere with your recording, which is exactly what law enforcement's doing in Florida. Now, I've been very vocal about not being on board with this whole police auditing garbage, okay? 99% of arrests, if not more, are all legitimate. And many times these people who call themselves police auditors are doing nothing more than agitating police officers needlessly, trying to see if they can catch a police officer doing something they're not supposed to, when in reality, even if you do catch them doing something they're not supposed to, they're the ones who enforce the law. Do you think they're going to enforce the law on themselves? It's a waste of time. It's completely wasteful. But in the case of this recent incident where I recorded this arrest in Bradenton, Florida, it does seem very questionable whether somebody is actually trespassing legitimately when you don't even know their name. That by itself would suggest that this was not a due process arrest, which is what homeless people have been telling me, that a lot of times when they're being arrested by law enforcement as homeless people, they're not getting due process. Law enforcement makes up their own rules of, you have to be out in 15 minutes, or other practices like destruction of property without warrants, which constitute a violation of due process. So now what law enforcement's aware of is, okay, we've been doing this for a while, but now they're starting to record us, which means we can't do it anymore. So what we're going to do now, we're going to prevent people from recording us. And I can guarantee you that the application of this law, when it is applied, will not be applied to ensure that people recording do not interfere with law enforcement. This is going to be when law enforcement's doing something they're not supposed to, they're going to go beyond the reach of the law's intended purpose. Advocating for due process is better than living in a totalitarian regime where law enforcement does whatever it wants. Now, this type of law enforcement already exists in states like Mississippi and Alabama, but what type of situations happen in those states? Well, you see situations like law enforcement in Mississippi with their goon squad, stuff like that. All right, guys, that is today's video, and the purpose of today's video is to inform you of SB184. Technically, it doesn't prevent you from recording or taking pictures, but it does require you to stay 25 feet away, which you should be doing already. Kind of a pointless law, but a law that will intentionally be used to interfere with people recording law enforcement, most likely when they're violating due process, which is the biggest problem that law enforcement is facing in Florida right now. I really don't think any particular segment of the population should be marginalized, because it shouldn't be done. It's just, that's not the way the United States works. This isn't a communist country where we say, okay, homeless people now don't have any more rights. A lot of people think, well, why do you care about their rights? Well, because they're humans too. They shouldn't be marginalized. But anyways, these are the laws that are taking place in Florida. I think we've seen, now the laws that are coming into Florida and the direction that these laws are heading. What they're insinuating is that Florida is trying to become kind of like Alabama or Mississippi, where law enforcement is this unquestionable power that can do whatever it wants. And the results are visible. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, these states with high incarceration rates also have the lowest life expectancy, the highest homicide rates, the highest firearm mortality rates. So if you want to turn Florida into Mississippi or Alabama, You know, one of the biggest draws that Florida has is that people want to live somewhere safe, but the state of Florida is no longer going to remain one of the safest states in the country. It went from being about average and safety. I think with these new laws that are being implemented, in 3 to 4 years, the state of Florida is going to have a crime rate on par with places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Perhaps not as far because culturally the state of Florida is differently, but, you know, institutionally, legislatively, Florida is going to look like those states. So you can assume that if Florida legislatively starts to look like those states, that the end result will eventually be the circumstances that those states have. High homicide rates, high crime rates, places literally people that are looking for safety are not going to move to. If you think that things like unconstitutional police checkpoints like the one we're going through in Birmingham, Alabama are acceptable, let's take a look at Birmingham, Alabama. Their homicide rate last recorded was 77 out of 100,000. That is 10 times higher than the state of Florida. So the results are clear. Unconstitutional actions from law enforcement does not create a safer place to live. A perfect example is this: Birmingham, Alabama, the only place in the United States where I have seen an unconstitutional police checkpoint like this is Birmingham, Alabama. And what are the results? Well, the results are that Birmingham, Alabama is the second most dangerous city in the country with a homicide rate of 77 per 100,000. That is more than 10 times the national average and about 13 times higher than a city like San Francisco. Now, San Francisco and Birmingham both have the same type of city government, so it's not about politics, it's about laws. It's laws that don't work. Why would you want your state to be like Alabama and Mississippi? I have no freaking idea, but that is a direction that Florida is heading in.